The heat had a way of creeping into everything that year. By mid-July, the sidewalks shimmered like sheets of glass, the air heavy with dust, and the once green lawns of Ridgewood Meadows had turned into a brittle carpet of yellow and brown. The city had declared an official drought emergency, urging every household to save water, to let their grass rest, to think beyond appearances. For Emily Carter, a schoolteacher who lived in the neighborhood for nearly 12 years, the drought wasn't just a headline, it was a daily reality. She cut her showers short, collected gray water from her sink, and let her front lawn fade into a patchy tan. "It's only grass," she would tell herself as she walked past the crisp blades. "Better a dry yard than an empty reservoir." But the Homeowners Association didn't see it that way. The first notice came tucked into her mailbox, printed on thick, glossy paper with the Ridgewood Meadows logo at the top. "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your lawn is in violation of community standards. Dead grass, brown patches, and unkempt landscaping diminish the overall value of our neighborhood. Please restore your yard to community guidelines immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines." Emily read the letter 3 times, her mouth dry. Restore her lawn? With what water? She turned the letter over, hoping for some mention of the drought restrictions, but there was none. Later that evening at the neighborhood mailbox cluster, she overheard her neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Walker, muttering as she pulled out the same notice. "They want me to water the grass," Mrs. Walker sighed. "And the city wants to fine me if I do. Which one am I supposed to listen to?" Emily managed a weak smile. "You're not alone," she said. At dinner, Emily vented to her husband, Mark. "This doesn't make sense. The governor's office literally told us not to water. The city's handing out citations. And now the HOA is threatening us because our lawns aren't green." Mark shook his head, stabbing at his food. "It's about money. Green lawns mean higher property values, and property values mean bigger bragging rights for the HOA board. They don't care about the drought. They care about control." The next morning, as she drove to school, Emily noticed the yards of several HOA board members, each one as lush and green as if the drought had skipped them entirely. Sprinklers twirled lazily in the early sun, soaking emerald grass. Her jaw tightened. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one was bolder. "Final warning, your lawn remains in violation. You have 7 days to comply or face fines of $150 per week." Emily crumpled the letter in her fist. That evening, she joined a few neighbors in the cul-de-sac. Mr. Harris, a father of 3, held his notice up like evidence in a trial. "They fined me already," he said. $200 for neglecting my lawn. You know what's funny? The city mailed me a warning last week too. Said if I watered outside the restricted schedule, they'd hit me with a fine. So which fine am I supposed to pay?" A murmur of frustration ran through the group. One by one, people pulled out their notices, each letter nearly identical. The HOA was demanding green lawns. The city was demanding conservation. And the homeowners were caught in the middle. "I can't afford both," Mrs. Walker whispered, her hands trembling. "I'm on a fixed income. If they keep this up, I'll lose my home." Emily felt a pang of anger. She had always thought of Ridgewood Meadows as a community, neighbors looking out for each other, children playing freely, families gathering on porches. But now the HOA seemed less like a protector and more like a predator. That night, she sat on her porch, the dry wind rattling the leaves of her oak tree. She thought about her students, about the lessons she taught them on fairness, integrity, and standing up for what was right. And she realized this wasn't just about grass. It was about dignity, about being forced into an impossible choice. Obey the city and pay the HOA, or obey the HOA and pay the city. Either way, homeowners like her were losing. She whispered to herself, almost like a vow. "They won't push me around." The porch light buzzed, moths circling in the dark. Emily leaned back in her chair, clutching the crumpled notice. The summer had only just begun, and already the drought wasn't the only thing sucking the life out of Ridgewood Meadows. Something had to give. The sun was merciless the following week, turning every afternoon into a shimmering haze. By now, Emily had learned to measure time not by the school bell, but by the sight of her neighbors dragging out hoses at odd hours, watering in secret as if committing a crime. On Tuesday morning, she returned from dropping her son at soccer camp to find a bright yellow envelope taped to her door. At first glance, she thought it was another HOA notice. But when she peeled it open, her stomach sank. It was from the City of Brookhaven Department of Water Resources. Notice of violation. Your residence has been observed in non-compliance with the Stage 3 drought restrictions. Watering of lawns is strictly prohibited outside designated days. Any further violations will result in fines up to $500 per incident. Emily froze on her porch. Observed? She hadn't watered at all. Mark came out with a cup of coffee, eyebrows raised. What's that? The city, Emily muttered, handing him the notice. They think I've been watering. Mark scanned it quickly, then let out a humorless laugh. So now we're guilty for not watering and guilty for watering. Great system. Emily pinched her forehead, trying to make sense of it. She hadn't touched the hose. Maybe a neighbor's sprinkler drifted onto her yard, or maybe the city inspector had been overeager. Whatever the reason, the message was clear: she was being watched from two sides. Later that afternoon, as she graded essays at the kitchen table, she spotted movement out of the corner of her eye. A man in a city-issued vest was slowly walking the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. He stopped in front of her property, crouched, and scribbled notes. Emily pulled the curtain just enough to watch him. He glanced at her yard, dry, brittle, and clearly unwatered, before making another note and moving on. The irony made her laugh bitterly. A dead lawn, and still she was being accused of watering. That evening, the neighborhood group chat on her phone buzzed nonstop. Did anyone else get a city violation? HOA says we have to water. The city says we can't. Which one takes priority? Just got fined $250 for watering at 9 p.m. I thought nighttime was safe. Emily typed quickly, I just got cited even though I haven't watered at all. Something's not right. Within minutes, replies poured in, neighbors sharing their own horror stories. One man confessed he had been watering at 3 a.m. to avoid patrols, but even then, a city worker left him a warning on his doorstep. By the weekend, frustration boiled into confrontation. Emily stood in line at the HOA office with a half-dozen other residents. The air was stifling inside, the walls plastered with framed, community values. At the front desk sat Mrs. Keene, the HOA president, a woman in her late 50s, immaculately dressed, with a permanent air of superiority. Next, Mrs. Keene called, adjusting her pearl necklace. Emily stepped forward, clutching the yellow city violation in one hand and the HOA letter in the other. Can you explain this? She demanded, her voice firmer than she felt. The city fined me for watering when I didn't. You fined me for not watering. Which one am I supposed to follow? Mrs. Keene barely glanced at the papers. Our responsibility is to uphold neighborhood standards, she said flatly. If lawns die, property values drop. That affects everyone. And the law? Emily shot back. The drought restrictions aren't optional. Mrs. Keene gave a thin smile. The city doesn't govern this community's appearance. We do. If you want to live here, you'll need to maintain your lawn. Green. That's the rule. Emily's pulse quickened. So you're telling me I have to break the law just to satisfy the HOA? The president leaned back in her chair. I'm telling you to decide which fine you'd rather pay. A murmur rippled through the line of homeowners behind Emily. Someone whispered angrily, another scoffed. But Mrs. Keene sat there, unbothered, as if she were dictating terms in a private kingdom. Emily walked out, her hands shaking. The late afternoon sun pressed down, but it wasn't the heat that made her sweat. It was the realization that the HOA had no intention of bending. At dinner, she told Mark everything. He listened quietly, then slammed his fork down. They can't do this. They're setting us up to fail. They want people to get fined so they can collect. Emily stirred her food absent-mindedly. It feels like a trap. No matter what we do, someone gets paid. That night, as cicadas droned outside, Emily sat on the porch again, staring at her parched lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler hissed in the dark, then cut off abruptly, Another neighbor sneaking water under the radar. Her phone buzzed with another HOA reminder. Final notice. Failure to comply with lawn maintenance rules will result in immediate fines and possible liens. Emily deleted it with a flick of her thumb. She knew something had to change, but for now, the pressure from both sides was suffocating. The city wanted compliance. The HOA wanted compliance. Neither cared that those demands contradicted each other. For the first time since she'd moved to Ridgewood Meadows, Emily didn't feel like a homeowner. She felt like a hostage. The mailbox had become a source of dread. Every afternoon, Emily would walk down the shaded path with her keys, stomach knotted, bracing for what new threat might be waiting inside. And sure enough, the envelopes were always there, crisp, white, stamped with the bold Ridgewood Meadows HOA logo. One Monday, she pulled out not one, but 3 letters. She opened the first right there by the mailbox cluster, neighbors glancing over curiously as she unfolded the paper. Notice of non-compliance. Your lawn remains below community standards. You are hereby fined $150. Failure to remit payment within 14 days will incur additional penalties. The second letter was nearly identical, only the amount had doubled, $300. The third sent her heart racing. Final demand. Continued non-compliance may result in a lien being placed on your property. Ridgewood Meadows reserves the right to pursue foreclosure if unpaid balances persist. Emily's knees nearly buckled. Foreclosure? Over dead grass? She stuffed the letters into her bag and hurried home, her mind whirling. On the porch, she tore them out again, rereading each line. The fines weren't just piling up, they were snowballing into something dangerous. Mark came out, wiping grease from his hands. What's wrong? Emily handed him the letters silently. His jaw clenched as he read. This is extortion, he spat. They're threatening to take our house. Over grass. Inside, their son Liam sat at the table, sketching a tree in his notebook. He looked up at his parents' tense faces. Are we gonna move? He asked quietly. Emily's chest tightened. No, sweetheart. We're not going anywhere. But the words felt shaky, like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The next morning, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. She marched back to the HOA office, the letters clutched in her fist. The air inside was cold, the hum of the AC almost mocking against the sweltering drought outside. Mrs. Keene looked up from her desk, her smile polite but empty. Mrs. Carter. Back again? Emily slammed the letters down. You fine me for something I can't legally do. The city will fine me if I water, and you fine me if I don't. How exactly do you expect me to comply? The president didn't flinch. She adjusted her glasses and flipped through the letters with slow, deliberate calm. Our community has standards. Brown lawns reflect poorly on everyone. If you can't maintain your property, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you. Emily's face burned. You're threatening foreclosure over grass. My husband and I worked for years to buy this home. It's not your right to take it away. Mrs. Keene folded her hands neatly. No one is taking anything. We simply enforce the rules that you agreed to when you moved here. If you won't comply, there are consequences. For a moment, Emily couldn't breathe. She wanted to shout, to slam her hands on the desk, but the smug expression on Mrs. Keene's face only hardened her resolve. Without another word, Emily turned on her heel and stormed out. By the time she reached her car, tears blurred her vision. She hated that woman. She hated how powerless she felt. That evening, Emily gathered with a few neighbors in Mrs. Walker's living room. The air smelled of old lavender, the blinds drawn tight against the heat. Each of them carried their own stack of letters, the papers rustling as they compared fines. I'm up to $450 already, muttered Mr. Harris, rubbing his temples. If they slap a lien on my house, I'm ruined. They told me I should install synthetic turf if I couldn't water, Mrs. Walker said bitterly. Do they know what that costs? Thousands. I'm 80 years old. I can't afford that. Emily spread out her letters on the coffee table. They're preying on us. They know we're scared of losing our homes, and they're using it to push us around. The room buzzed with frustration. For the first time, Emily realized this wasn't just her fight. Every homeowner in Ridgewood Meadows was a pawn in the same cruel game. That night, lying awake beside Mark, she stared at the ceiling fan slowly spinning overhead. "I feel like I'm suffocating," she whispered. "If we water, we lose. If we don't, we lose. They've trapped us." Mark reached for her hand. "Then we stop playing by their rules." Emily turned her head, surprised. "What do you mean?" His grip tightened. "We fight back." The word hung in the air. Fight. Emily had never thought of herself as a fighter. She was a teacher, a neighbor, a mother. But maybe that was exactly why she had to fight. Because the people around her, good people like Mrs. Walker, didn't have the strength left to. As dawn crept through the blinds, Emily made herself a silent promise. She would not let the HOA bully her family into submission. What she didn't know was that the HOA was about to escalate even further, and the fight ahead would test her more than she ever imagined. By July, the drought was merciless. Grass wasn't just brown anymore. It was brittle, crumbling underfoot like straw. The once lush lawns of Ridgewood Meadows now resembled hayfields, save for a few suspiciously green patches that stood out like emeralds in the desert. Emily noticed them on her evening walks. Some neighbors were watering at night, sprinklers hissing under the cover of darkness. They whispered about it quietly, careful not to admit too much, but the proof was there: green lawns in a season when nothing should be green. Mark frowned when she mentioned it. "They're risking city fines." Emily's voice cracked. "But they don't have foreclosure notices sitting on their kitchen table." It was true. The HOA's pressure was suffocating. Emily could barely focus at work, her mind consumed by the growing fines. Each new envelope in the mailbox felt like a countdown clock, ticking closer to disaster. One Saturday evening, she stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at their withered front yard. Liam sat at the table coloring, his crayons scratching quietly. She whispered to Mark, "We could do it too. Just once. A little water at night. No one has to know." Mark looked at her as though she'd suggested robbing a bank. "Emily, the city's patrols are out there. If we get caught, it's another fine. Maybe worse." Her hands gripped the counter. "We're already drowning in fines. If keeping the HOA off our backs buys us some breathing room, maybe it's worth the risk." For the first time in weeks, Mark didn't argue. He just rubbed his forehead and said, "If we're doing this, we do it smart." That night at 1 a.m., they crept outside. The neighborhood was silent, only the hum of distant crickets filling the air. Emily's heart pounded as Mark dragged the hose across the yard, its metal nozzle scraping softly against the pavement. When the first stream of water hit the parched grass, Emily almost cried. The earthy smell of damp soil rose instantly, sharp and nostalgic, like a reminder of better times. She wanted to laugh with relief, to dance barefoot on the wet lawn. But the fear smothered her joy. They worked quickly, watering only the front, careful not to make puddles. After 20 tense minutes, Mark shut the hose off, coiling it back like evidence. They hurried inside, whispering as if the night itself could overhear. For 2 days, nothing happened. No letters. No knocks. Emily let herself breathe again, even smiled when Liam pointed out the faint green tint returning to the lawn. Then, on Wednesday afternoon, she came home to find 2 envelopes in the mailbox. One from the HOA, one from the city. Her hands shook as she tore them open. The city's letter came first. Citation issued. Unauthorized lawn watering during restricted drought period. Fine, $500. Her throat tightened. The HOA's letter followed. Notice of inspection. Your lawn has shown signs of improvement. This indicates recent watering. Be advised, failure to comply with community standards will result in additional fines. Emily's vision swam. They'd caught her from both sides. Mark found her sitting on the couch, the letters limp in her lap. She looked up, her face pale. "We can't win. We follow the rules, we lose. We break the rules, we lose. It's all a trap." Mark paced the living room, running his hands through his hair. "They want us cornered. They think if they squeeze hard enough, we'll pay anything. Or walk away." Liam peeked out from the hallway, sensing the tension. "Mom? Dad? Are we in trouble?" Emily forced a shaky smile. "No, honey. We're just figuring things out. But inside, her resolve hardened. She was tired of feeling helpless, tired of watching her family live under constant fear. The next day, she gathered the neighbors again at Mrs. Walker's. This time, the room was filled to capacity, every chair taken, people standing along the walls. Faces were weary, angry, desperate. Emily held up her 2 letters. This is what happens when you try to please them. You get punished no matter what you do. A murmur swept through the room. Others held up their own envelopes, their own stories of double-edged punishment. Mr. Harris spoke up, voice trembling with rage. We're being fined into bankruptcy. They want us scared so we don't fight back. But maybe it's time we do. Emily met his eyes. She thought about her son, about the smell of wet earth in the dead of night, about the smug smile on Mrs. Keene's face. Her voice was steady when she said, "Then let's stop waiting for them to break us. Let's fight." The room fell silent, but it wasn't hesitation. It was the heavy, shared realization that something had shifted. This wasn't just about lawns anymore. It was about survival. And for the first time, Emily wasn't afraid of the HOA. She was ready to stand against them. What she didn't know was that the HOA had already prepared its most ruthless move yet. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, inside the Ridgewood Meadows Community Center. Normally, these gatherings were half empty, a handful of retirees and board members droning on about paint colors and mailbox heights. But that night, Emily wasn't alone. Word had spread fast. By the time she arrived, the small hall was already buzzing, folding chairs filled, people leaning against walls. The air was hot and tense, charged with the weight of weeks, months, of frustration. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before now stood shoulder to shoulder, united by the same stack of fines and threats. Mark squeezed Emily's hand as they entered. "Ready?" She nodded, though her stomach churned. She had never been the type to seek attention, but the HOA had pushed her too far. Fear had transformed into resolve, and she wasn't turning back. At the front of the room, Mrs. Keene, the HOA president, adjusted her glasses and tapped the microphone. Her voice was sharp, authoritative, as if she were scolding a room full of misbehaving children. "Good evening, residents. As you know, tonight's meeting will cover several agenda items: lawn maintenance, community compliance, and upcoming fines for continued violations." A ripple of groans moved through the crowd. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She glanced at Mark, who gave her a small nod. Before Mrs. Keene could continue, Emily rose from her seat. Her voice was clear, louder than she expected. "Before you start talking about fines, we need answers." All eyes shifted to her. Some neighbors nodded eagerly, others looked nervous, but not one person told her to sit down. Mrs. Keene's eyebrows arched. "Excuse me, Mrs. Hart? You'll have your chance to speak during the open forum." Emily stood taller. "No, we'll speak now. Because every single person in this room is drowning in fines, from the city for watering, and from you for not watering. You've put us in an impossible situation, and you refuse to acknowledge it." Murmurs of agreement spread through the hall. People clapped softly, then louder, until the room was echoing with frustrated applause. Mrs. Keene's face tightened. "Order! Order! This is highly inappropriate." Emily raised the letters in her hand. "Is it inappropriate to show what you've done? Because here's proof, $500 from the city for watering, and another notice from you accusing me of not watering enough. Which is it, Mrs. Keene? What exactly do you want from us?" Gasps rippled through the room. Several residents stood up, holding their own letters, waving them like evidence in a trial. "This is extortion," one man shouted. "They're bleeding us dry," a woman added. The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. But Mrs. Keene tried to maintain control, slamming her gavel against the table. "You all agreed to community standards when you moved here. Green lawns are essential for property values." "Property values?" Emily cut in. Her voice cracked with emotion. "What about our homes? What about the families who are getting foreclosure notices because of your greed? What about the parents deciding between paying fines or paying for groceries?" The room erupted with cheers. The tension was no longer fear, it was fury. Mrs. Keene's composure faltered. She turned red, fumbling with her notes. These are rules. Rules must be enforced. Emily stepped forward. No. Rules must make sense. Rules must serve the community, not destroy it. You're enforcing green lawns during a drought. You're forcing us to break the law to obey you. And then you punish us no matter what we do. That's not leadership. That's abuse. The crowd roared its approval, louder than ever. Someone pounded the back wall in rhythm, others stomped their feet. For the first time, the board members looked rattled, eyes darting nervously across the room. Mark whispered, "You've got them. Don't stop now." Emily lifted her chin. "We are done paying fines that contradict state law. We are done living in fear of letters and threats. From this moment, we, the residents, demand a suspension of all lawn-related fines until the drought restrictions are lifted. And if you refuse..." She paused, letting the silence build. Every person leaned in. "Then we'll take this beyond Ridgewood Meadows. We'll take it to the media, to the courts, and to every homeowner in the state who's tired of HOAs that care more about grass than people." The room exploded. Cheers, applause, shouts of support shook the walls. Neighbors who had once felt isolated now realized they weren't alone. They had power, together. Mrs. Keene banged her gavel until her hand trembled. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, her voice cracking. She and the other board members fled the stage, faces pale, papers scattered in their rush. Emily stood there, heart pounding, surrounded by neighbors clapping her on the back, thanking her, hugging her. For the first time in months, she felt hope. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. The HOA had been embarrassed, cornered in front of the very people they tried to control. And people like Mrs. Keene didn't give up easily. The real fight was only beginning. The night after the meeting, Emily barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the image of Mrs. Keene storming out, gavel in hand, her face flushed with anger. Emily knew that people like her didn't crumble quietly, they struck back. Sure enough, the retaliation came within days. On Monday morning, a new letter appeared in Emily's mailbox. It was thicker than the usual violation notices, folded in stiff, official-looking envelopes. She ripped it open and scanned the lines, her stomach tightening. "Due to repeated acts of disruption and incitement, your membership in the Ridgewood Meadows HOA is under formal review. Pending investigation, further disciplinary action, including property liens, may be considered." Her hands shook. They weren't just fining her anymore. They were threatening her home. When she showed the letter to Mark, his jaw set in anger. "They can't do this. They think they can scare us back into silence." But Emily knew this wasn't just about her anymore. The meeting had awakened something in the neighborhood, a unity that had never existed before. Within hours, she texted a few neighbors, and word spread like wildfire. By evening, 20 families gathered in Emily's backyard, under the dim glow of string lights and citronella candles. "I got one too," said a middle-aged man named Carlos, holding up an identical letter. "They're trying to single us out, divide us. But they messed up. We're stronger together." Emily nodded. "They're banking on us being too afraid to fight back. But if we all stand, they can't intimidate us." The group discussed options. Someone suggested legal action. Another proposed going straight to the media. Emily's heart raced as ideas bounced around, and for the first time, fear was outnumbered by determination. By the end of the night, they had a plan. Form a neighborhood committee independent of the HOA. Document every violation notice, fine, and threat. Reach out to local news outlets, not as individuals, but as a united community. The next week was a blur of action. Emily found herself at the center of it all, coordinating emails, collecting letters, listening to neighbors' stories. The absurdity piled up: retirees fined for replacing lawns with drought-tolerant plants, single parents threatened over wilted flower beds, veterans harassed for flags and garden choices. When the local paper finally published the headline, it struck like a lightning bolt across the state. HOA fines residents for following state drought laws, community fights back. Within hours, the story spread online. News stations picked it up. A reporter knocked on Emily's door, camera crew in tow, asking for interviews. She stood on her porch, nervous but resolute, speaking for everyone. We're not against community rules. We're against rules that punish us for obeying the law and protecting our homes. We just want fairness. Neighbors stood behind her, nodding, holding up copies of their fines. The visual was powerful. The impact was immediate. Calls poured into the city council offices. Social media exploded with outrage. Other neighborhoods chimed in with their own HOA horror stories. Suddenly, Ridgewood Meadows wasn't just a small-town struggle, it was the face of a statewide issue. And the state listened. 2 weeks later, a new bill was introduced in the legislature, a law prohibiting HOAs from enforcing lawn requirements during declared drought emergencies. It was bold, controversial, and exactly what Ridgewood needed. Mrs. Keene, however, wasn't finished. She and the board doubled down, issuing new threats, claiming the community was under siege by media lies. But the tide had shifted. Where once residents had cowered at her letters, now they laughed, tossing them into a folder labeled evidence for court. At the next meeting, the room was packed again. Only this time, the board sat stiff and silent as residents lined up to speak. One after another, they called for transparency, accountability, and finally, a vote to recall the HOA president. The motion passed with overwhelming support. Mrs. Keene slammed her papers into a bag and stormed out, her gavel clattering uselessly against the table. She never returned. Months later, life in Ridgewood Meadows felt different. The lawns were a mix of natural grasses, drought-tolerant landscaping, and yes, still some green patches watered sparingly, but no one was fined. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved, chatted over fences, and checked in on each other. Emily sat on her porch one golden evening, sipping iced tea as kids biked past, and Mark tinkered with the sprinkler system he'd adjusted to conserve every drop. Carlos stopped by with his dog, smiling. You know, I think we actually have a community now. Not because of the HO, but in spite of it. Emily smiled softly. Funny, isn't it? They tried to scare us into silence. And instead, they gave us a voice. She looked at the yard, not perfect, not uniform, but real. And for the first time since the drought began, she felt at peace. The fight hadn't been easy. It had been exhausting, emotional, and terrifying at times. But it had proven something powerful. When ordinary people stand together, even the most rigid systems can bend. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily whispered to herself, not in anger, but in quiet triumph, "They can't fine us for hope.